My name is Emily Parker. I am 32 years old, and I grew up learning that being the strong one often meant being the forgotten one. I carried my sister through school, I paid bills no one thanked me for, and I convinced myself that one day my family would finally see me. But the night I came back to my parents' house in Denver, everything I thought I knew cracked wide open. From the hallway, with my suitcase still by the door, I heard voices through a thin gap of light. My mother's tone was careful, my sister's laugh was eager, and together they were weaving a plan. They weren't just leaving me out of her wedding. They were discussing my fiancé as if he were theirs to use, a resource for their fairy tale. In that moment, I felt a kind of betrayal I had never known before. What would you do if you overheard the people you love most plotting to erase you from their story? Stay quiet or finally step into the light? Stay with me, because what happened next will leave you breathless. Let me take you back to where it began. The carpeted hallway in my parents' house in Denver always carried the faint smell of lemon polish and old coffee, the kind of scent that felt permanent, like wallpaper you could never peel away. I was passing by the living room that night, suitcase still by the front door, when I heard my name. I froze before I even realized what I was doing. The door was almost closed, just a slim gap of light spilling out. I leaned closer, every muscle in my body tense. My mother's voice drifted through, steady and careful, the way she spoke when she wanted something. If Daniel agrees to fund part of the reception, Sophie won't have to stress about the cost. It will be seamless. My heart thudded hard enough I thought they would hear it. Then Sophie's laugh, high and eager, filled the pause. Emily doesn't need to know. She'll just complicate things. This is my day. Daniel won't mind. My chest tightened as if someone had pressed a weight there. They were talking about my fiancé, about my future husband. They weren't just cutting me out. They were planning to use him. I pressed a hand against the cool wall to steady myself. My mother's voice lowered again. The Whitmores want perfection. We can't let Emily be part of this. She always draws attention to herself. Better to keep her name out of it. The words sliced clean through me. For a moment, all I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears. My little sister's wedding was weeks away, and they had already erased me, like I was some loose thread they could snip without consequence. I stepped back, slowly, careful not to make the floor creak. The lemon polish scent was suddenly nauseating. My suitcase looked out of place by the door, as if mocking me for even showing up. I wanted to push open that living room door and scream to ask how many times I had to sacrifice for them before they saw me. Instead, I picked up my bag and walked quietly toward the guest room, each step heavier than the last. Inside the room, I closed the door and leaned against it. My pulse was erratic, my breathing shallow. Daniel's name in their mouths felt like theft. He had no idea they were plotting to make him a wallet for Sophie's dream wedding. He thought he was marrying into a family, not a scheme. I sat on the edge of the bed, fingers digging into the comforter. The memories started pouring in uninvited. Sophie at 12 with a sprained ankle carried around like porcelain. I was 14 then, standing in the corner with a perfect report card no one asked about. Mom had kissed Sophie's forehead and said my sister had such a delicate spirit, while I was the strong one, the one who didn't need tending. Strong. The word had been weaponized my whole life. Strong meant invisible. Strong meant less deserving. Strong meant convenient. I stared at the ceiling fan, turning slowly, its blades groaning with every spin. The urge to confront them twisted in my gut. I pictured myself storming into the living room, calling them out, watching their faces pale. But I didn't move. I thought of Daniel instead, his calm eyes, the way he always noticed when I went quiet too long. If I told him now, he would be furious. He would want to shield me. But part of me wanted to see what they would do if I stayed silent just for a while and let their own words trap them. The clock on the nightstand blinked past midnight. My phone buzzed with an email notification, probably from work in San Diego. I ignored it. My whole body felt wired, buzzing with betrayal. I had known my mother favored Sophie, that was never a secret. But hearing her plot to keep me out to manipulate Daniel, it was something else entirely. It wasn't neglect anymore. It was deliberate. I lay back on the bed, fully dressed, staring at the shadows crawling along the ceiling. I thought about every time I had stepped in for Sophie, the tuition checks, the essays I stayed up writing, the lease I covered when she wanted to move in with a boyfriend who lasted less than a season. And still, on her biggest day, I was nothing but an inconvenience. Sleep didn't come. I drifted in and out, catching fragments of my own thoughts. What if Daniel found out some other way? What if the Whitmores believed I was part of it? What if silence was just another form of surrender? By dawn, I was still awake, the thin light seeping through the curtains. I pulled myself up, splashed water on my face in the small bathroom, and caught my reflection in the mirror. My eyes were red, but my jaw was steady. Something in me felt different, as though a cord had been pulled tight and finally snapped. When I went downstairs, the house was quiet. Sophie and Mom had gone to a bridal appointment. Dad was sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee, the newspaper folded beside him. He looked up briefly and nodded. "Morning, Em." His tone was casual, detached like always. He didn't ask how I slept. He didn't notice the tension brimming under my skin. I made coffee without a word, the clink of the mug loud in the silence. I wanted to ask if he knew, if he had been part of the whispering. But his eyes stayed on the paper, as if nothing unusual had happened. Maybe he didn't know, or maybe he chose not to. I sat across from him, sipping the bitter coffee. My hands stopped shaking after a few sips. The kitchen clock ticked steadily each second, reminding me I had a choice. Stay quiet, play the part they wanted, or finally stop letting them write me out of my own life. I thought of the living room door, the sliver of light, the voices planning my erasure. I thought of Daniel's hand in mine, steady and real, and knew that silence would not save me. For the first time in years, I let myself imagine a different kind of ending. One where I didn't wait for their approval. One where their whispers no longer dictated who I was allowed to be. The coffee grew cold between us, my father still flipping the same page as though time hadn't moved. I stood, pushed the chair back gently, and walked out of the kitchen. Upstairs, my suitcase waited, still packed. I zipped it closed and set it by the door again, heart steady this time. I wasn't sure yet what I was going to do, but I knew one thing with absolute clarity. I was done pretending I hadn't heard them. And that decision, quiet as it was, felt like the beginning of something I could finally call mine. The sound of the front door shutting downstairs jolted me. Sophie's laughter trailed faintly through the walls, bright and easy, as if nothing about last night had happened. I sat on the edge of the bed with my hands pressed together, the echoes of their whispers still looping in my head. It was like a bruise under my skin, sore every time I thought about it. I had lived with that bruise since I was a girl, long before Sophie's wedding, long before Daniel, long before my life had taken shape in San Diego. I remembered being 10 years old, standing in the kitchen doorway of this same house, holding up a drawing I had worked on for days. Charcoal smudged my fingers, and I had been proud of every line I managed to bring to life. Sophie was curled on the couch with a fever, and Mom sat next to her, stroking her hair with a kind of tenderness I only knew from watching. Mom never looked up. She just said, "Get your sister some ginger tea, honey." I remember lowering the drawing slowly, the pride leaking out of me like air from a balloon. I made the tea, put the drawing on the counter, and no one asked about it again. Those small things stacked up year after year. Sophie's ballet recital was a family affair. Everyone dressed up, dinner afterward, flowers in her arms. My debate trophy sat on the hallway shelf, gathering dust, no celebration, no picture for the family album. When I graduated high school, Dad gave me a pat on the shoulder and told me he was proud in his own quiet way. When Sophie graduated, they rented a hall and threw a party with balloons and catered food. Dad was never cruel. He was just absent in ways that mattered. He fixed the sink when it leaked, he kept the grass cut, he read the weather report out loud at breakfast. But when Mom made comments about Sophie's delicate temperament, about how she needed more attention, he nodded, drank his coffee, and turned the page of the newspaper. By the time I hit 16, I had stopped asking for anything. I figured out scholarships, filled out FAFSA forms on my own, worked weekends at the public library to cover gas money and clothes. Sophie had me editing her college essays when I was barely keeping up with my own. I remember her texting me from the back seat of a car half drunk, saying she had forgotten an application deadline. I stayed up until 3 a.m. finishing it for her. She got in. She always got what she wanted. I stared at the suitcase by the door and felt the same knot in my chest I had carried all those years. It was one thing to feel invisible. It was another to realize they had turned me into a liability, a distraction to be hidden. The house felt too quiet now. I walked down the hallway toward the kitchen, passing the photographs on the wall. There was Sophie in her tutu at 7, Sophie holding her first car keys at 16, Sophie at her college graduation. I was in some of the photos too, standing in the background, half cropped out, holding Sophie's bouquet while she smiled at the camera. I traced one frame lightly with my finger and pulled it back quickly, as if even that small touch might betray how badly it hurt. In the kitchen, the morning light made the countertops look harsh, every scratch and stain standing out. I poured another cup of coffee and sat at the table. My father's old words echoed in my mind, the ones he had said when I was applying for Duke. "You'll be fine, Em. You've always been strong." I had hated that word then, but I never argued. Being strong had become the excuse for their neglect. I took a sip of the coffee, bitter and lukewarm, and stared at the clock. My hands itched to call Daniel to spill everything, but part of me wanted to hold back. I wanted to carry this truth for a moment, on my own, to feel its weight before I shared it. The front door opened again, and Mom's voice called up the stairs, light and cheerful, asking Sophie if she wanted lunch. My jaw tightened. They had no idea I knew. They were moving forward with their plan, as if my existence had never interrupted them. I stood quickly, the chair scraping against the floor. I went back upstairs and into the guest room, shutting the door with a sharp click. My heart was racing, but my mind was strangely calm. The truth was, I had always known this moment would come, though not exactly like this. The whispers through the door were only the loudest version of what I had felt for years. I pulled open my suitcase and sat on the floor beside it. My clothes were still folded, neatly untouched from the night before. I pressed my palms against them, grounding myself. Memories flooded back again. Sophie, opening gifts at her sweet 16 party while I stood behind her chair collecting the wrapping paper, Mom snapping photo after photo of Sophie's smile while I went unnoticed. The quiet consistency of it all was the part that stung most. I closed my eyes and let the silence settle. There was a strange clarity in finally seeing things as they were, not as I had hoped they could be. My family had always chosen Sophie. They had always painted me as capable enough to be forgotten. Last night had only confirmed it with sharper edges. The air in the room felt stale. I opened the window and let in the cool Denver breeze. Outside, the street was lined with familiar houses, neighbors walking their dogs, a kid riding his bike in lazy circles. Life went on ordinary and unbothered while mine felt like it had cracked wide open. I leaned on the windowsill and whispered to myself, testing the words out loud. I am not invisible. The sound was small but real. From somewhere downstairs, Sophie's voice rose again, laughing with Mom about cake flavors. The sound dug under my skin, sharp and grating. I pushed the window closed and sat back down on the bed, gripping the blanket tight in my fists. The truth was undeniable now. I could keep playing my part, pretending not to notice, or I could let this be the breaking point. The clock ticked steadily beside me. Noon sun was starting to cut across the floor. I lay back slowly, staring at the ceiling fan turning in its lazy circles, and let the thought settle in me with a strange kind of peace. The choice had already been made. It was only a matter of time before I said it out loud. By the time I landed back in San Diego, my body felt like it had been running on fumes. The flight was short, but the weight of Denver clung to me, the voices through that half-open door still echoing in my head. I rolled my suitcase across the parking garage and into my car, the late afternoon sun glaring off the windshield. My inbox was already buzzing with reminders, deadlines, requests. Work never paused. Not for family, not for heartbreak. The next morning I walked into Harbor Capital Partners with my usual careful armor, a tailored navy dress and heels that made my steps sound confident even when I didn't feel it. The office smelled like burnt espresso and paper toner, the soundtrack, a mix of phone calls and tapping keyboards. I took a deep breath, ready to slip back into my role, but the unease in my chest stayed with me. At the morning meeting, I sat across from Greg, one of the senior associates who had a talent for stealing other people's ideas. We were reviewing a proposal I had spent 2 weeks perfecting. Charts, risk assessments, recommendations, every word chosen carefully. When the managing director asked for an overview, Greg cleared his throat and launched into my pitch line for line as if it had sprung from his head overnight. I felt my jaw tighten. My notes were spread open in front of me, identical to the words spilling out of his mouth. The managing director nodded along, occasionally interrupting with a question that Greg fumbled through, glancing down at the pages I had printed for him the day before. Not once did he acknowledge me. When the meeting ended, everyone stood shuffling papers, already talking about lunch. Greg clapped me on the shoulder as he passed. "Nice work on that draft, Em. We make a good team." I stared at him, the room suddenly too loud. He walked away before I could respond, leaving me holding my own stolen work in my hands. I went back to my desk, sat down heavily, and opened my email. A new message blinked at the top of the list. From Sophie. My stomach dropped before I even clicked it open. "Hey sis," she wrote. "I need a quick favor. Can you polish up my bio for the wedding program? Joanna Whitmore's people will probably see it and I want it to look professional. Thanks a million." Attached was a Word document. I opened it with trembling hands. Her bio claimed she had graduated from Greystone College in New York, a school I had never heard her mention before. It listed internships at companies I knew she had never worked for. It was dressed up, polished, and full of lies. I sat back in my chair, my pulse hammering. She wanted me to clean it up, to make it convincing. Just like the nights I had rewritten her essays, just like the mornings I had saved her from deadlines. This was different. This wasn't about helping her scrape by. This was deception meant to impress her fiancé's wealthy family. I stared at the blinking cursor on the screen, frozen. If I ignored it, she would hound me until I gave in. If I did it, I would be complicit. I closed the document and pressed my hands over my eyes. The voices from Denver surged back, my mother saying better to keep Emily out of it, Sophie laughing, that I would only complicate things. They wanted me invisible, yet here she was still expecting me to fix her mess in the shadows. My phone buzzed on the desk. A text from Greg. "Client loved the proposal. Great work. I'll handle the follow-up." I wanted to throw the phone across the room. Instead, I locked the screen and leaned back. The walls of Harbor Capital felt smaller than ever, every cubicle a box, every face turned away. At lunch, I sat alone on the terrace with a plastic container of salad I couldn't bring myself to eat. A group of junior analysts laughed at another table, carefree, unburdened by the weight of invisibility. My hands shook as I scrolled through my phone. Sophie had posted a picture from a bridal boutique, smiling, wide veil pinned into her blonde hair. My mother stood beside her, hands clasped, eyes glowing. The caption read, "Blessed. Not one mention of me." The salad wilted in the heat, untouched. I shut the container and pushed it aside. That afternoon I forced myself through spreadsheets and calls, my voice steady even as my chest burned. By the time I packed up to leave, the office lights were dimming, the cleaning crew moving quietly between desks. I carried my laptop bag down to the parking garage, each step echoing like a reminder. In the car I pulled up Sophie's email again. The lies stared back at me. For a moment I imagined sending it straight to Joanna Whitmore, exposing Sophie for exactly who she was. But my fingers didn't move. Not yet. The city outside my windshield blurred into streaks of red and white lights. I drove home in silence, the air thick with everything I hadn't said. When I unlocked the door to my apartment, the quiet hit me like a wave. I dropped my bag on the couch and sank down beside it. My laptop sat heavy in my lap as I opened Sophie's file once more. The cursor blinked, waiting. I didn't type a word. I shut the computer, leaned back, and closed my eyes. I knew then that something had to give, either at work, at home, or both. Because if I kept swallowing their thefts and lies, there would be nothing left of me at all. Saturday afternoon found me sitting at a corner table in a small cafe in La Jolla, staring at a half-empty cup of chai I had forgotten to drink. The walls were lined with photographs of surfers and sunsets, but I barely saw them. My mind was still tangled in Sophie's email, the fake college, the fabricated jobs, the way she had dropped it on me, like I was still her safety net. When Alyssa walked in, the room shifted. She always carried herself like she knew exactly who she was, dark hair tied back in a messy bun, sunglasses pushed up onto her head, and a tote bag slung carelessly over her shoulder. She spotted me immediately and crossed the cafe with quick steps. "You look like someone set your house on fire," she said, as she slid into the chair across from me. I let out a shaky laugh. "Close enough." She studied me, her sharp eyes narrowing. "Spill it." I hesitated, then pulled my laptop out of my bag and opened Sophie's email, turning the screen toward her. Alyssa scanned the bio, her brow arching higher with every line. "Greystone College," she said flatly. "That place doesn't exist." I nodded. "And she wants me to make it look professional." Alyssa closed the laptop gently and leaned forward. "They are using you. Again." The words cut through me because I already knew it. I pressed my hands together on the table, trying to steady them. I heard them. Mom and Sophie. They were talking about keeping me out of the wedding. About asking Daniel to pay for it. Like I'm a problem they need to hide but still useful enough to milk. Alyssa's mouth dropped open slightly, then closed with a snap. "That is so sick." I stared at the chai, watching the cinnamon flecks swirl at the bottom. "It's not like it's new. They've always treated me like the strong one. The one who doesn't need attention. But this, it feels worse." Alyssa reached into her tote and pulled out a long garment bag. She laid it across the table dramatically, making the couple beside us glance over. "What is this?" I asked. She unzipped it slowly, a grin spreading across her face. A dress. Not just a dress. A declaration. The fabric shimmered as she pulled it out, crimson silk that caught the light even in the dim cafe. It was cut on the bias, elegant and unapologetic, the kind of dress that refused to blend into the background. I shook my head. "Alyssa, I can't. That's too much." She pushed it closer. "You can and you will. This isn't about Sophie or your mom. It's about you showing up for yourself." I touched the fabric with trembling fingers. It was cool and smooth, foreign against my skin. The thought of wearing it made my stomach flutter with both fear and excitement. Alyssa leaned in. "I've watched you shrink yourself for years, Em. You're always the fixer, the quiet one, the backbone. This dress is not for fixing. It's for living." Her words pierced through the fog in my chest. I folded the dress carefully back into the bag, my throat tight. We sat there for a while in silence, the hum of the cafe filling the spaces between us. Finally, I whispered, "They want Daniel's money. That's what all of this is about." Alyssa's eyes softened. "Then let them want, but you don't have to give." Later that evening, I carried the garment bag into my apartment and hung it on the back of the bedroom door. It loomed there like a dare, daring me to believe I could step out of the shadows they had written me into. I paced the living room, the city lights flickering beyond the balcony. My phone buzzed with another message from Sophie. "Any update on my bio? Need it polished by tomorrow." I stared at the words, then shut off the screen. The red dress was still there when I crawled into bed, glowing faintly in the dim light, a reminder that maybe it was time to stop being the strong one who carried everyone else. Maybe it was time to carry myself. Daniel noticed the garment bag before I even said hello. It was still hanging in the hallway when he came over that night, his hand brushing against it as he set his keys down on the counter. He glanced back at me with a half-smile that carried more curiosity than judgment. New, he asked, his tone light. I nodded, slipping off my shoes. Alyssa gave it to me. She said it's not a dress, it's a declaration. He chuckled softly, loosening the cuffs of his shirt. That sounds like her. Are you going to wear it? I hesitated, then shrugged. I don't know. It feels too bold. Daniel crossed the room and touched my arm, his expression calm but serious. Emily, you don't need anyone's permission to take up space. Not mine, not theirs. The words sank into me heavier than he probably meant them to. I wanted to tell him about Denver, about the whispers through the door, but the lump in my throat stopped me. Instead, I busied myself with pouring us both a glass of wine. He waited patient, as always, letting me find the words in my own time. Finally, I said quietly, "They want you to pay for Sophie's wedding." His hand stilled on the stem of the glass. Who told you that? I looked at him, my chest tightening. I overheard Mom and Sophie. They were planning it out. How to keep me out of the way, how to make it look like you were supporting them. They don't want me there, Daniel. They just want your money. He set the glass down untouched. His jaw flexed, but his voice stayed steady. That explains a lot. My eyes widened. What do you mean? He leaned back against the counter, crossing his arms. A few weeks ago, your mom asked me to look at a contract for the venue. She said it was just to double-check the numbers. I skimmed it, nothing stood out at the time, but now… The room tilted slightly around me. You didn't think to tell me I didn't want to worry you, he admitted. But hearing this from you now, it's clear. They're trying to use us. A bitter laugh escaped my throat. Not us, just you. I'm nothing but an inconvenience. Daniel stepped closer, his voice firm. Don't say that. You are the reason I'm here, not them. My chest ached with the weight of it all. I had expected anger from him, maybe even disbelief, but not this steady certainty. He reached for my hand and held it, grounding me. I don't care about their wedding, he said. I care about you. And if they can't see your worth, that's their blindness, not yours. Tears burned the edges of my eyes, but I blinked them back. You make it sound so simple. It is simple. You've spent your whole life shrinking for them. Stop. I searched his face, looking for any flicker of doubt, but found none. For the first time in days, maybe years, I felt like I wasn't carrying this weight alone. We ate dinner quietly, the city buzzing outside the windows, the tension between us softer now. Later, as we sat on the couch, Daniel spoke again, his voice low. You know what I want, Emily, what? A life where you don't have to prove yourself every day. Where you're not apologizing for being seen. The room went still. I knew he meant it, and I knew he was asking more than the words suggested. I whispered, and if my family never accepts me, then we build a life where their acceptance isn't necessary. The silence after that wasn't heavy. It was alive, humming with something new. I looked over at the garment bag hanging in the hall, the red silk folded inside, and for the first time I wondered if Alyssa was right. Maybe it wasn't just a dress. Maybe it was a beginning. Daniel leaned his head back against the couch, eyes half closed, and I sat beside him, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant traffic. My phone buzzed on the table. Another message from Sophie. Did you fix my bio? Yet I turned it face down without opening it. The night stretched out in front of us, quiet and fragile, and I let myself breathe. For once I didn't feel invisible. I felt chosen. Sunday morning sunlight poured into my apartment, bouncing off the glass table where my phone kept buzzing with notifications. I had ignored Sophie's texts the night before, but the pull of curiosity was stronger than my resolve. With a sigh, I opened Instagram and scrolled. The first photo that appeared made my breath catch. It was my mother and Sophie at a bridal boutique in Nashville, Sophie beaming in a strapless white gown with lace sleeves, Mom clasping her hands as if she were witnessing a miracle. The caption read, "A dream made real," with the hashtag blessed. I stared at the photo, my thumb frozen on the screen. But what unsettled me most was the comment pinned at the top. Thank you to Daniel Brooks for being such a generous supporter of Sophie's big day. The words blurred. They were not only using Daniel's name, they were broadcasting it publicly, bragging to the world as if he were funding her wedding. My stomach flipped, nausea crawling up my throat. I scrolled through the comments. Guests chimed in with "Congratulations, lucky girl." What a perfect match. Not one person asked where I was. I set the phone down and pressed my palms against my face, trying to steady myself. Daniel was still asleep in the bedroom, his slow breathing a faint rhythm in the quiet. I wanted to storm into the boutique, rip the phone out of Sophie's hands, and make her delete every lie. Instead, I sat there paralyzed, staring at my own reflection in the darkened screen. My phone buzzed again. A new message from Sophie. Did you see the post? Isn't it amazing? Everyone's talking about how perfect it all looks. Can you send me the bio today? My chest tightened, a sharp ache that spread to my shoulders. I typed a response and erased it 3 times. Finally, I wrote, "Sophie, you need to stop using Daniel's name. That is not your right." Her reply came fast. "Don't be dramatic. It's not a big deal. He won't care. This is about family, not ownership." Family. The word cut deeper than the rest. I could practically hear her smug voice through the screen, dismissing me the way she always had. I stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor, and went to the balcony. The ocean air carried a cool breeze, but it did nothing to ease the fire inside me. I wanted to scream. Instead, I clutched the railing until my knuckles went white. Behind me, I heard Daniel stirring. A moment later, he stepped onto the balcony, hair tousled, still half asleep. "Morning," he murmured, wrapping an arm around my waist. I stiffened. "Daniel, they're posting about you." He blinked awake, frowning. "Posting what?" I grabbed my phone and showed him the photo and the caption. His eyes narrowed as he read. The muscles in his jaw tensed, but his voice stayed even. "They really think they can get away with this," I whispered. "They don't even care if I see it. It's like I don't exist to them." Daniel turned to me fully, his hands firm on my shoulders. "You exist to me, and they won't get away with this forever." The certainty in his tone steadied me for a moment, but when he walked back inside, I lingered on the balcony. The city stretched out before me. The photo was already climbing in likes, spreading, further cementing their version of reality. Later that day, I sat with my laptop open, Sophie's fake bio still on the screen. I thought about all the times I had rescued her before patching over her mistakes so no one would see the cracks. Every keystroke I might add now would be a choice to keep enabling her. The email alert chimed again. Another message from Sophie. "Don't forget, the Whitmores will be reading this. Make it good." I closed the laptop slowly, my hands trembling. By evening, Alyssa called. Her voice came through the speakers, sharp and concerned. "I saw the post, Em. Are you okay?" I swallowed hard. "Not really." "You can't let them do this. It's fraud, plain and simple." "I know," I whispered. "But if I push back now, they'll twist it. They'll say I'm jealous or bitter or trying to ruin Sophie's big moment." Alyssa was quiet for a beat, then said, "So let them. The truth always finds its way out." After the call ended, I sat in the dark living room, staring at the dress bag hanging on the door. The red silk inside seemed to glow faintly, a reminder of a choice I hadn't yet made. I could feel the storm gathering, the lies growing bigger, the threads pulling tighter. And deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before everything snapped. Daniel came home later that week, carrying a folder under his arm, his expression calm but shadowed with something I couldn't read. He set it on the kitchen table and sat across from me, the air between us heavy before he even spoke. I asked softly, "What is it?" He tapped the folder once, then opened it to reveal copies of contracts, venue agreements, and financial forms, all stamped and signed. My name wasn't anywhere, but Daniel's was. At the bottom of one page, his signature had been traced in a sloppy imitation. My stomach dropped. "That's not yours." "No," he said evenly. "It's not." I picked up the paper, my fingers trembling. The loops and lines were close, but they weren't his. It looked like a rushed attempt by someone who had seen his signature before, but didn't know its subtleties. "Who did this?" I whispered. Daniel leaned back, arms crossed. "Your mother handed these over to the Whitmores last week. She told them I had agreed to sponsor part of the wedding." Heat flooded my chest, sharp and suffocating. "They forged your signature." Daniel's eyes met mine, steady but cold. "Yes." I shoved the papers back across the table, my pulse racing. "This isn't just lying, this is illegal." He nodded once. "That's why I asked Marcus to look at it." Marcus was one of Daniel's closest friends, a corporate attorney in Los Angeles, a man who thrived on details. I swallowed, suddenly aware of the enormity of what we were staring at. "What did he say?" Daniel clasped his hands together, his voice low. "He said we could press charges. Fraud, forgery, misrepresentation. But he also said timing matters." I pushed my chair back and stood pacing the length of the kitchen. The lemon-scented cleaner clung to the air, sharp against my nose. All I could think about was Mom's voice, smooth and calculated, saying better to keep Emily out of it. "So what, we just wait?" I asked, my voice rising. "We let them keep parading around, dragging your name into everything." Daniel stood slowly and came to me, resting a hand on my arm. "I know you're angry. I am too. But if we move too soon, they'll twist it. They'll claim it was a misunderstanding, a clerical error. And the Whitmores might look the other way." I pulled back, shaking my head. "They've done this my whole life." Lied, twisted, covered for Sophie. "And now it's not just me. They're dragging you in too." Daniel's voice hardened. "And that is exactly why we won't let them get away with it." I sank into the couch, burying my face in my hands. Every nerve in me was buzzing, the betrayal sharper than anything before. It wasn't only erasure anymore, it was theft. Daniel sat beside me, quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Marcus suggested we gather everything. Emails, messages, posts. Build a record. When it's time, we show the Whitmores the truth." I looked at him, the steadiness in his eyes anchoring me, even as the ground beneath me tilted. "And if my family denies it, then the documents speak louder than their lies." I exhaled slowly, trying to catch my breath. The weight of it pressed down on me, but there was also a flicker of something else. Relief. For once the truth wasn't only mine to carry. That night, after Daniel fell asleep, I sat in the living room with the folder open in my lap. The copies smelled faintly of ink and paper dust, ordinary in every way except for what they represented. I traced the forged signature with my fingertip, my chest tightening with rage. I remembered the nights I had spent writing Sophie's essays, the checks I had mailed to cover her rent, the excuses I had made for her. I had told myself it was family, that loyalty was love. But looking at that sloppy imitation of Daniel's name, I understood something I hadn't wanted to admit. To them, love was just leverage. The city lights blinked beyond the balcony, indifferent and bright. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, another message from Sophie, lighting up the screen. "Need the bio as soon as possible. Don't forget." I let it buzz until it went dark again. The folder stayed open in my lap, the pages rustling when the air conditioner kicked on. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of what would happen when the truth came out. I was afraid of how far my family would go to protect their lies. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight. I closed the folder carefully, my hands steady now, and set it on the table. In the silence of the apartment, one thought settled deep in my chest, unshakable. This time they had gone too far. The train ride into New York was long enough to leave me restless, but the city's skyline breaking through the gray morning haze filled me with a mix of awe and dread. Daniel had business meetings lined up, and I had tagged along, needing space from San Diego, from Sophie's relentless emails, from the folder of forged papers that still haunted me. We checked into a hotel near Central Park, the kind with polished marble floors and bellmen who greeted Daniel by name as if they already knew who he was. I felt small walking beside him, my heels clicking on the tile, my suitcase trailing behind. That evening, we attended a dinner hosted by one of his investors. The restaurant was dimly lit, all dark wood and hushed voices. the kind of place where deals were whispered over wine glasses that cost more than a month of groceries. Daniel fit effortlessly into the scene, shaking hands, making introductions, his calm confidence magnetic. I stood beside him, smiling politely, until I heard a voice call my name. Emily. I turned and found myself staring at Ryan Cole, a former colleague from Harbor Capital. His smile was polished, practiced the same as it had been back in San Diego. "Emily Parker, I didn't expect to see you here." I forced a polite smile. "Hi, Ryan. It's been a while." He glanced at Daniel, then back at me, a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. "Heard you were still grinding it out at Harbor. How's that going?" The question was casual, but the undertone was sharp. He knew exactly how it was going. He had been part of the culture that left me invisible. I swallowed hard, searching for a response, but Daniel spoke first. "Emily's work speaks for itself," he said evenly. "She's not someone who needs to prove herself in this room." Ryan's smile faltered. He excused himself quickly, muttering something about a phone call. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, a mix of gratitude and shame. Later, when we were alone in the back of a cab, Daniel turned to me. "You're wasting yourself there." I looked out the window at the blur of lights. "It pays the bills. That's not enough," he said quietly. "You've been carrying other people for too long. What would you do if you didn't have to answer to anyone?" I laughed, softly shaking my head. "I don't know. I've never thought about it." He studied me, his gaze steady. "Think about it now." The words stayed with me through the next day, echoing in my head as I walked through the city streets while Daniel was in meetings. I ducked into a bookstore in Soho, the smell of paper and ink grounding me. I picked up a journal and ran my hand over the blank pages, imagining what it would feel like to write a plan that was mine alone. That evening, Daniel took me to a rooftop overlooking the city. The skyline glittered endless and alive. He handed me a glass of champagne and said, "This is what I see when I look at you. Possibility." My throat tightened. I wanted to believe him, wanted to see myself the way he did. But all I could hear was my mother's voice, sharp and dismissive, saying, "Better to keep Emily out of it." I whispered, "What if I fail?" "Then fail on your own terms," he replied. "But don't stay small just because it's comfortable." The wind tugged at my hair, cool against my flushed cheeks. For the first time in a long while, I felt something stir inside me that wasn't resentment or anger. It was the faintest spark of hope, fragile but real. When we left New York 2 days later, I tucked the empty journal into my bag. I hadn't written a word yet, but I carried it like a promise, a quiet reminder that maybe I didn't have to keep playing the role my family had written for me. On the flight back, Daniel reached over and laced his fingers with mine. His touch was steady, warm, certain. I stared out at the clouds drifting past and let myself wonder if it was finally time to step out of the shadows. Back in San Diego, the air felt heavier than when I had left, as if the city itself carried the weight of everything I had overheard behind that bedroom door. I returned to my condo, dropped my bags by the couch, and sat in silence, letting the stillness wrap around me. For days I'd replayed the words my mother whispered to Sophie, their laughter echoing in my ears. I had thought the anger might fade with distance, but instead it sharpened, cutting through every distraction. Daniel noticed immediately. "You're somewhere else," he said one evening as he poured me a glass of wine. I shook my head, tracing the rim of the glass with my finger. "I just can't stop hearing them. The way they planned everything, like I was nothing. The way they said you'd bankroll it if they played their cards right." Daniel set the bottle down and looked at me. "Then make sure they learn you are not their safety net." The firmness in his tone startled me, but it settled into my bones like a truth I could no longer ignore. A week later, I was back at Harbor Capital. The office smelled of burnt coffee and recycled air, and the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. I sat at my desk, staring at the numbers on the screen, my mind blank. Across the room, my manager Frank leaned back in his chair, laughing too loudly at some joke on the phone. He hadn't spoken to me directly in days, except to dump work on my desk with a clipped reminder that it was due by noon. That morning he dropped another stack of reports beside me without looking up. "These by Friday," he said flatly. I stared at the papers, then back at him. Frank, I said, my voice steady, I need to talk to you. He glanced up annoyed. Make it quick. I took a deep breath. I'm not going to keep cleaning up for you. I've covered your mistakes more times than I can count, and I've had enough. His smirk faltered, replaced by a flash of irritation. Careful, Emily. That sounds a lot like insubordination. No, I said, it sounds like resignation. The silence that followed felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Frank blinked, then laughed, but it rang hollow. You're bluffing. I stood, collected my bag, and looked him straight in the eye. Watch me. I walked out without looking back, my heart pounding but lighter than it had felt in years. Daniel was waiting for me at a cafe downtown. When I told him what I had done, he didn't look shocked. He smiled, slow and deliberate. About time, he said. But underneath the relief, fear curled in my chest. What now? He reached across the table, taking my hand in his. Now, you build something for yourself. The words scared me as much as they excited me. That night, I opened the journal I had bought in New York. For the first time, I began to write. Ideas poured out of me, scribbled plans, fragments of what a consulting business could look like. A place where I didn't have to fight to be seen. While I worked, my phone buzzed with a string of messages from Sophie. Venue tours today, cake tasting tomorrow. She sent photos of chandeliers, floral arrangements, a cake taller than me. Each image was like a knife twist, proof that her dream wedding was moving forward without a hitch, funded by my parents, and with the expectation that Daniel would eventually foot the rest. I didn't reply. Instead, I posted a single photo on social media taken by Daniel in New York. Me on the rooftop, the skyline behind me, champagne glass in hand. The caption read, "Only starting something new." By the next morning, my inbox was full. Old colleagues reached out, strangers messaged, women asking if I offered mentoring or consulting. It wasn't a business yet, but it was a spark, and the spark was enough to begin. Meanwhile, word spread faster than I anticipated. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in years texted me. Just saw your post. So proud of you. Did Sophie know? I didn't answer, but I knew she had seen it. Sophie always saw everything. 2 nights later, my phone rang. It was my mother. I hesitated before picking up. Emily, she said, her voice brisk, I heard you quit your job. I leaned against the counter, staring at the city lights through my window. That's right, and what exactly are you planning to do now? Build something of my own. She scoffed. Don't be ridiculous. Stability is everything. You think Daniel is going to take care of you forever. My chest tightened, but I kept my voice calm. I don't need him to take care of me. Her silence was sharp, then she said coldly, You're making a mistake. No, I said, I'm finally making a choice. She hung up without another word. I stood there, phone still in my hand, the silence pressing in. For the first time, I didn't feel the urge to call back, to explain, to beg for understanding. I let the silence stand. Later that week, Daniel suggested a trip. Hawaii, just the 2 of us. You need air, he said, real air. Somewhere far from all of this. I wanted to argue, to say I had too much to figure out, but when I looked at him, I realized he was right. The thought of leaving behind the weight of San Diego, even for a little while, felt like a lifeline. We booked the flights. I packed light, slipping the journal into my bag, the pages already filled with beginnings. On the night before we left, I sat on my balcony, the city glowing beneath me. My phone buzzed again, another message from Sophie. This time, it was a video of her in a glittering dress, twirling under the lights of a ballroom. She wrote, Can't wait for you to see it all come together. I didn't reply. I closed my phone, set it aside, and let the night air wash over me. I didn't know what Hawaii would bring, but I knew one thing for certain. I was done playing the part they had written for me. This time, the story would be mine. The first morning in Maui felt unreal, as if the ocean had swallowed all the noise that used to follow me everywhere. I woke to the sound of waves brushing against the shore and the soft hum of palm leaves tapping against the balcony railing. Daniel was still asleep, his breathing, even his face softened by the glow of early light. For a while, I just watched him thinking about how far I had come from the girl who once begged for scraps of affection at my parents' table. Later, as we walked down to the beach, the sand warm beneath our feet, Daniel slipped his hand into mine. He said nothing, and that silence felt like the safest place I had ever known. By the second day, he surprised me with a private boat ride. The captain, a sunburned man named Cole, grinned as he helped us aboard. The boat was small but steady, cutting across the turquoise water with ease. I wore the crimson dress. Alyssa had given me the fabric catching the wind, as if it had been waiting for this moment. Daniel watched me from the other side of the deck, his expression somewhere between pride and awe. He took out his phone, snapped a photo without asking, and handed it to me. The image startled me. My back was to the camera, hair tangled by the breeze, the ocean behind me stretching like forever. I didn't look like someone who had been erased. I looked like someone who had finally stepped into her own skin. "Post it," Daniel said gently. I hesitated, then opened Instagram and typed without thinking. "Not all families deserve your RSVP." I pressed share, then slipped the phone back into my bag. The rest of the afternoon, we drifted across the water sipping wine. Cole had packed diving into the ocean when the sun grew too hot. For a while, I forgot everything. The wedding, the whispers behind the door, the years of being overlooked. All of it blurred into the salt air and the rhythm of the waves. But by the time we returned to the villa, my phone was buzzing nonstop. Notifications stacked one after another, likes, comments, messages from people I hadn't spoken to in years. I ignored them until one caught my eye. It was from my cousin Laura. "Did you mean to do this?" she wrote. I frowned, opened the thread, and saw a screenshot of my post shared in a private Facebook group. Someone had tagged Joanna Whitford, Thomas's mother. My stomach tightened. Joanna was the type of woman who valued control more than anything else. My caption had found its way into her world, and I knew she wouldn't ignore it. Daniel noticed the change in my face. What happened? I showed him the message. He read it slowly, then set the phone down on the table. "It begins," he said. I wanted to argue, to pretend it was nothing, but deep down I knew better. By the next morning, the ripple had grown into something bigger. My aunt texted me from Texas, "Honey, I don't know what's going on, but people are talking. Stay strong." I scrolled further, finding more messages, some from friends, some from strangers. A few were supportive, others curious, and a handful edged into pity. But the one that stayed with me was from an old coworker. She wrote, "They see you now." Later that afternoon, Daniel and I sat on the terrace overlooking the sea. He poured 2 glasses of wine and slid one toward me. "Any regrets?" he asked. "Only that I waited this long," I said quietly. We clinked our glasses and let the silence stretch between us. Meanwhile, in Dallas, things were unraveling faster than I could have imagined. Joanna had already called in her assistant, ordered background checks, and begun digging into Sophie's resume. She discovered the lies about Greystone College, the fabricated internships, the carefully constructed image Sophie had fed her. It was only a matter of time before she acted. I didn't know any of that yet, not in detail, but I could feel the shift in the air. Sophie stopped posting her wedding updates. My mother's silence grew heavier. Even my father, who rarely reached out, sent me a short text. "Call your mother. She's upset." I didn't call. Instead, I walked down to the beach at dusk, the tide pulling against my ankles, and let myself imagine what would happen when the truth finally caught up to them. For years, I had carried their weight funded. Their choices stayed silent so they could shine. Now the silence belonged to me, and I wasn't giving it back. That night, as Daniel and I ate grilled fish by candlelight on the terrace, my phone lit up with a name I hadn't expected. Sophie. I stared at the screen, the phone vibrating against the table. Daniel raised his eyebrows. "Are you going to answer?" I let it ring out. Minutes later, a message appeared. "Why are you doing this to me?" I didn't reply. I set the phone face down and took another sip of wine. Daniel reached across the table, brushing his fingers against mine. You don't owe her anything. I nodded, though part of me still ached with old habits, that instinct to explain, to fix, to soothe. But I didn't move. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of salt and hibiscus through the open doors. For the first time in years, I felt no rush to respond, no need to apologize for existing. The next morning, the first headline appeared. It wasn't about me directly, but about the Whitford family. Rumors of a cancelled reception, whispers of last-minute changes, speculation about the bride's background. My post had been the spark, but the fire was catching everywhere. I sat on the balcony, with my coffee, scrolling through the news, heart pounding. This was only the beginning. By the time Joanna Whitford made her decision, the wedding day had already begun. In Nashville, sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the venue, glinting off crystal chandeliers and rows of perfectly aligned chairs. Caterers bustled, photographers adjusted their lenses, and Sophie was upstairs in a robe with a glass of champagne in her hand, convinced everything was about to unfold as perfectly as she had dreamed. But downstairs, Joanna spoke to the planner with a voice like steel. Cancel the reception, she said. Cut it down to immediate family only. Send the staff home once the ceremony is done. The planner blinked, stammering, but Joanna's stare left no room for negotiation. Within an hour, the ballroom, meant for 300, stood half dark. The floral wall dismantled, the band packing up their instruments without ever playing a note. The whispers started almost immediately. Vendors murmuring into phones, cousins texting one another, guests asking why their travel arrangements had suddenly been altered. Sophie had no idea yet. She sat in her bridal suite, makeup, half-done hair, pinned in curls, scrolling through messages from her bridesmaids. She typed a quick caption under a photo of her dress and hit post. The likes began rolling in before she set the phone down. It was only when her mother Marilyn slipped into the room, face pale and voice tight, that Sophie sensed something was wrong. Honey, Joanna made changes. There won't be a reception, just the ceremony. Sophie laughed, sharp and disbelieving. What do you mean, no reception? That's impossible. She signed off on everything. She approved the tasting. Marilyn shook her head, her eyes glistening. I can't stop her. She controls the funding. Sophie's chest constricted as she grabbed her phone, frantically texting Thomas. What's going on? Why aren't you saying anything? He replied minutes later, short and cool. Mom found out things you didn't tell me. We'll talk later. Her throat closed as she read the words mascara, smudging at the corners of her eyes. She tried calling him, but it went to voicemail. Her bridesmaids hovered, whispering, exchanging glances. For the first time, Sophie's perfect picture cracked. Meanwhile, I was half a world away, sitting at a cafe in Maui, the sea breeze brushing across my shoulders. Daniel had gone inside to order us another round of coffee, and I stared down at my phone, scrolling through notifications. My post from the boat had spread far beyond my circle. Strangers were sharing it, commenting on it, attaching their own stories. Then I saw it. A headline from a local society blog: Rumors surround Whitford wedding amid last-minute changes. My caption had been quoted, my name mentioned. I set the phone down, my stomach twisting, realizing that whatever had begun was no longer mine to control. Daniel returned with 2 mugs, setting one in front of me. You look like you've seen a ghost. They're unraveling, I whispered. He didn't ask who. He didn't need to. Back in Nashville, the chapel filled quietly. Only a handful of family members seated. No music floated from the piano, no photographer hovered for candid shots. When Sophie walked down the aisle in her lace gown, she looked radiant to anyone who didn't know the truth. But I knew. Her smile trembled at the edges. Her hand clutched the bouquet too tightly. Her eyes darted once to Thomas, who stood stiff and distant at the altar. They exchanged vows in muted tones, their words echoing awkwardly in the half-empty space. The minister's voice carried louder than it should have, almost filling in for the guests who weren't there. When it was done, when they kissed and turned to face, the small gathering, the silence that followed, was deafening. No applause, no cheers, just a polite murmur and the rustle of dresses as people shifted in their seats. Afterward, Sophie retreated to the bridal suite, tears threatening to spill, her phone buzzing non-stop. She picked it up only to find messages she didn't want to see. Screenshots of me in that red dress on the boat. A headline from Verve Style featuring my name alongside the phrase, "Quiet Power." Even Camille, her old college friend, sent a message that cut sharper than any knife. "You didn't tell me your sister was practically a feature model now. Not a good look, Soph." Sophie threw the phone down, pressing her hands to her face, her makeup smearing against her palms. She tried to breathe, tried to convince herself this was still her day, but deep down she knew the truth. Her mother tried to comfort her. "It's just one day, honey. It will pass." But the words rang hollow even to her. Thomas knocked once, then entered the room. He didn't smile. He didn't offer congratulations. He only said, "We need to talk." Sophie's hands dropped to her sides, her heart hammering. "About what?" "About the lies," he said flatly. "The college, the internships, the way you painted yourself as something you're not. My mother knows everything." Her mouth opened, but no words came. He looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time, not the bride he married, but the stranger who had just cost him his mother's trust. Across the ocean, I sat with Daniel on the balcony that night, wine glasses in hand, the moonlight casting silver shadows on the water. My phone lit up again, Sophie's name flashing. I hesitated, then let it go to voicemail. Seconds later, a message arrived. "You ruined my wedding." I stared at it for a long time, my chest tightened not from guilt but from the finality of it. For years I had been their scapegoat, their fixer, their forgotten shadow. Now I was their reckoning even without trying. Daniel reached over, slipping his arm around me. "You don't have to carry it," he murmured. I nodded slowly, setting the phone aside, the night air heavy with everything unsaid. In Nashville, Sophie sat alone in her gown, the bouquet discarded, her phone buzzing on the table beside her. Each notification was another reminder that the story had slipped from her control. She had wanted a fairy tale. Instead, she had given the world a scandal. And somewhere deep down, she knew the sister she had erased was the one everyone was finally seeing. When I landed back in San Diego, the air felt heavier, but cleaner. Somehow, like the city itself knew I had left behind something that no longer belonged to me. Daniel carried my bag from the car while I fumbled with the keys, still tired from the long flight, yet steady in a way I had never felt before. My condo smelled faintly of lavender from the candle I had forgotten to blow out weeks earlier, and as I stepped inside, I realized that for the first time I was walking back into a life that was mine alone. The days that followed moved slowly but with purpose. I unpacked, I washed clothes, I opened my journal, and kept writing ideas about the consulting firm I wanted to build. By the end of the week, I had filed the paperwork, chosen a name, and set up a small office in a building downtown. Quinn Strategies. It looked simple, written on the frosted glass door, but it carried the weight of everything I had survived. Clients came quicker than I expected. Women from Los Angeles and beyond reached out after reading my posts, some whispering their own stories of being overlooked, erased, or dismissed. I listened. I advised, I helped them make choices that reminded me of the night I walked out of Harbor Capital and never looked back. Each meeting felt like stitching together a part of myself I had once believed was lost. One afternoon, I opened my inbox to find an email from Joanna Whitford. She wanted to meet. My chest tightened as I read her words, polite but deliberate. I didn't know if it was strategy or curiosity that drove her, but I agreed. When she arrived at my office, she wore her power like a second skin, yet her eyes betrayed a flicker of something else. She looked around at the walls, the desk, the stack of business cards with my name printed clearly. She said quietly, "You have built something here." I nodded, calm, not needing her approval. She studied me for a moment longer and then said, "I misjudged the picture. I want to understand the frame." It wasn't an apology, but it didn't need to be. It was recognition, and that was more than I had ever been given by my own family. A week later, I received a text from Sophie. A photo appeared. First, a newborn swaddled in pink, her tiny face soft and fragile. The words beneath it read, "Do you want to meet your niece?" My breath caught not from anger, but from something harder to name. I stared at the photo for a long time, remembering the years I had carried Sophie. The nights I stayed up writing her essays, the moments I sacrificed while she soaked in applause. I didn't reply. I deleted the message not out of cruelty, but because sometimes the cleanest endings are the ones we choose ourselves. Daniel came home that evening with takeout and a bottle of wine. When he saw my face, he didn't ask what was wrong. He just set the food down, poured me a glass, and sat beside me until the silence felt steady again. He reminded me that families are not always the people who share your blood. Sometimes they are the people who choose to stay when everything else falls away. As the weeks passed, I found my rhythm. Early mornings with coffee on the balcony, afternoons with clients who believed in my guidance, evenings with Daniel where laughter came easier than it once had. I didn't scroll through my mother's posts anymore. I didn't look for Sophie's photos. They had written me out of their story, but I had written myself into one I no longer wanted to escape. Months later, Quinn Strategies hosted its first seminar in Los Angeles. The room was filled with women who had carried too much for too long, their eyes bright with a mix of fear and hope. As I stood at the front of the room and spoke about resilience, dignity, and the strength of starting over, I felt a current move through me. I wasn't the forgotten daughter anymore. I wasn't the shadow at the table. I was the voice, steady and unshaken, telling them what I had once needed someone to tell me. You are not small. You are not invisible. You are enough. That night, back in my office, I sat with the lights off, looking out over the city. My phone buzzed with messages from attendees thanking me, telling me how they finally felt seen. I closed my eyes and let their words wash over me. The girl who had once begged her mother to notice her had finally noticed herself. If you have ever been erased, overlooked, or told you don't matter, I want you to hear me now. You are allowed to choose yourself. You are allowed to walk away from the rooms that keep you invisible and step into the ones where your voice carries. Families may fail you, but you don't have to fail yourself. If my story has touched something inside you, I would love to hear your thoughts. Share your own journey in the comments. Let me know if you've ever had to rebuild from silence. If this story resonated, please like it so more people can find it, and subscribe if you want to stay with me for more stories of survival, justice, and the kind of strength that doesn't need anyone's permission. Sometimes the greatest revenge is not loud or cruel. Sometimes it is simply choosing to live fully when they expected you to disappear. And that choice, I promise you, is always enough.